Hello. This week's lecture topic will be perceiving color. Essentially, how do we see and interpret the colors in our environment? We'll cover how seeing color is not only involved in the eye, and we'll also discuss how different environmental factors can affect how we see color. Colors are not simply a function of differing wavelengths. They are our response to visual stimuli via complex processes that occur in our perceptual apparatus. And this apparatus is not just the eye, but the optic nerves and the mind. The eye and the mind work together to see color. One of the most intriguing color phenomena in nature and also in the world of art and design is iridescence. And here we have two examples of it. We have iridescence in nature as seen in the beetle on the right, and then iridescence in art and design as seen in the Thierry Mugler dress on the left. Both of them have this iridescent quality to them, this pearlescent sheen, this ability to project a different color depending on how the viewer looks at the object and depending on the position of the object itself. The key to this iridescence is actually an illusion. There are layers and layers of transparent films, if you will, that have been built up on each other, and each layer is textured. So if you can imagine very thin layers with microscopic textures that are sort of ribbed, think about maybe a piece of corduroy material, something that has highs and lows. As the light hits those highs and lows of the textured surfaces, different colors are reflected back, bounced back. And as these layers are stacked one on top of the other, light goes in and light comes back out, but it passes through every layer on the way to the bottom and then back out from the top. So this is why this surface changes so much. And we love iridescence. You can find iridescent leather goods. You can find iridescent paint jobs on cars. And we also see it in nature with insects and even, an oil slick on water. That has an iridescence to it. So this is color, but it's also illusion as well. These processes that we experience with our visual apparatus involve the way our eyes register colors, classify the inputs, and transfer them to the brain, and the way the brain decodes those messages. Much of our color perception can only be described theoretically. The reason for this is that when we do color studies, when we observe people looking at objects, looking at colors, responding to their environment, we have to go off of what they tell us. We have to then create a theory based on what our exam group has told us they are seeing or they are experiencing. This isn't something we can assess in a laboratory setting in an analytical way without a live subject. A lot of what we understand about the human body very well is because we have done things like autopsies. We have found out, how many chambers are in the heart. We found out how big the pituitary gland is. But as far as the process of seeing something, we really have no way to know exactly how it is done. We can only create a theory of how people see. So in this diagram, we have those three circles up in the upper left. The way people see is multi-layered. We see an object in motion first, then through focus, we see the shape of it, and then we see shadow, and then we see colors. So we see an object in 4 different ways, which is rather interesting on its own. And then that information is taken by the optic nerve up to the brain, and then that equation is solved, if you will. The brain tells us what we're looking at. The eye is just the window that the object is seen through. So without taking us into a full-on biology class, we're going to go over some of the parts of the human eye. The first part on our list, in no particular order, is the sclera, and this is the whites of the eye. The cornea is the transparent window of the eye. The conjunctiva is a mechanism that lines the eye with mucus. The iris is the colored part of the eye. The lacrimal gland is what forms tears and keeps the eyes moist. The foria centralis and malleus lutea give us acute image formation and color vision. Choroid is the middle layer of the eye that prevents light from scattering. The pupil is the center of the iris, a muscle that controls light entering the eye. The retina is the innermost layer of the eye, housing the rods and cones, which we'll discuss in a little bit. And then we have the optic disc, which is interestingly a blind spot in the eye that does not have rods or cones. So in this sort of cross section of the human eye, we have all of our different parts sort of lined up and placed where they go. And for light and color to be perceived, the first step is for light to enter the eye through the cornea. So remember, the cornea is our window that lets everything into the eye. The muscles of the iris then contract or expand to allow light through the pupil, depending on the amount of light available. So this is why you might have your pupils dilated or not dilated, depending on the amount of light in the environment you're in. The light which has been emitted is then focused on the back surface of the eye by 3 refracting media: the aqueous humor, the crystalline lens, and the vitreous humor. The back of the eye is covered by the retina, which consists of layers of specialized cells. The layer most important to color vision consists of photoreceptors called rods and cones. Rods allow us to distinguish forms in dim light, but only with black and white vision, so they don't see color. Cones, functioning under brighter light, allow us to see hues. So the cones are what let us see color. The stimulation of cones also excites the rods, revealing that they function in high light as well. So here's our textbook diagram of rods and cones. We call them a cone because they taper towards the top. We call these rods because they look more cylindrical. And then here, under extreme magnification, we can see the rods and the cones. And you see that the cones are considerably smaller than the rods. Before light reaches the rods and cones, it must also pass through layers of nerve cells. Only 20% of the light that reaches the retina actually registers with the rods and cones. The rest goes unseen. After light excites the rods and cones, electromechanical messages are relayed to the brain through the optic nerve. The 100 million rods and 6 million cones in each eye communicate with the brain via the optic nerve. The photoreceptors communicate to the brain across synapses or gaps in a network of nerve fibers. The bipolar and ganglion cells will then gather and pass signals between the rods and cones. Information from the 2 eyes is transmitted to both sides of the brain, where it is integrated to form a single image. So the graphic we have above shows a diagram or an image of a viewer looking at an animal, and the eye does not see a complete image. The eye only sees part of the image, and the brain joins the image together. When I was younger, and honestly, I still do this today, sometimes I would close one eye and leave the other one open and then bounce back and forth. with one eye open, one eye closed. And I noticed that the object I was looking at would sort of move in position. Even though the object was stationary, it would sort of move slightly. I wouldn't see a full picture of it. I wouldn't see a full image of the environment because one eye was closed. And sometimes I even noticed that the color was more vivid through one eye than the other. So this is what the brain is doing. It's taking the problem and solving it for you. As I said, it's bringing those two images together into one. 1/3 of gray matter of the cerebral cortex is involved in this process of unifying images. Another phenomenon of the human eye, and really the eye of any mammal, is that because the eye is concave, the images that it sees are actually inverted. So in this graphic, we have the eye viewing a woman in a green dress, but when the eye sees it and it comes in through the cornea and the iris, the image is inverted. And this we have concluded through theory. If you look at the bowl of a spoon, which is also concave, you'll see that your image is inverted. It's because you're looking at a concave reflective surface. So something else that your brain does is it takes the environment and writes it. It puts it the right way up. Your brain, as I said, is a supercomputer. And your brain wants to control chaos. Imagine the world upside down. Things would not end well. So your brain is solving those problems and making your life easier. And one of the things it's doing is showing you things the right way around instead of upside down. Because of course, it'd be very disorienting if everything was inverted. We see color most accurately in a narrow field of view, which is roughly 2 degrees directly in front of our eyes. So in the diagram, we see that if we are walking through a space, because of the way our eyes are positioned, we have about 130 degrees of view without turning our head. Our sharpest detail is seen in only 2 degrees. So this is why some people might bring an object closer to their face if they're reading or examining it, because that is our sharpest detailed view of our environment. At the center back of the eye is an area of about 1 millimeter in diameter known as the fovea. It contains only cones. Light falling on this area gives the sharpest color definition. When we are examining details in an image, we automatically move our eyes until what we want to see is covered, or rather centered, on the fovea. So it's instinctual that we move objects we wish to focus on over the fovea. The muscles of the eye are the most active muscles in your body, contracting 100,000 times per day on average. So imagine if you had an avid reader, if you had an artist, if you had someone that was constantly moving and analyzing, it would be more movement in the eye. But if you have someone that isn't very active, of course, they're going to have less movement. So the average eye is 100,000 times per day, which is, again, crazy if you think about it. Science has no definitive proof of how cones work. They do know rods contain discs of a light-sensitive pigment called visual purple, or rhodopsin. When light strikes this pigment, it bleaches, reducing the electrical signals for darkness otherwise transmitted by the rods. In the dark, our rods have large amounts of unbleached rhodopsin, allowing us to perceive forms with very little light. Cones also contain light-sensitive pigment called iodopsin. One theory is that there are 3 kinds of cone pigments. One for sensing the long-range wavelengths, which are reds and oranges, one for the middle, which is greens, and one for the short, which is blue and violet. These cone pigments are thought to mix and form all color sensations. This theory of color mixing occurring in the eye is called trichromatic theory. It first emerged in 1801 under English physicist Thomas Young and later developed by German physicist Hermann von Helmholtz. This theory, however, only explains what happens under direct light stimulation. It is now thought that the communication to the brain is handled differently. It is believed colors may be perceived in pairs of opposing or complementary colors. According to the opponent theory, some response mechanism, perhaps specialized cells in the cortex, registers signals of either red-green, blue-violet, or yellow. In each pair, only one signal can be carried at a time, while the other is inhibited. Another set of cells responding to variations of white and black does not operate on opponent colors, but offers a range of values. So here's a diagram of that opponent theory. So we have an achromatic or a light and dark situation where there is no color being shown, only lightness and darkness and shadow. And then the other part of chromatic theory expresses that there may be a complementary system going on. So red and green are complementary colors. So one might turn on, the other might turn off. And this is how we might view color. Yellow and blue are complements. So one turns on, one turns off. So I've got a couple of fun little exercises here. So with this opponent theory, where we might be thinking about the eye seeing colors in pairs of complements, we can kind of explore that by looking at this image. So we have an image of a woman in 4 different colors. I want you to look at the cross at the center, that T symbol at the center, and focus on that. Don't look at the woman, just focus on the cross. Some of you might have done this in a science class before, but if you keep focusing on that cross, your eye is going to get used to looking at these 4 colors. And your eye is going to begin to recognize that as being normal and something that it has adjusted to looking at. So it's going to start working less because it's now thinking that, okay, this is what I need to be looking at. I don't have to think about it. It's what my environment is. I'm just going to get used to it. And then if you jump over to the black X, you'll see that you have some complements. You might see some glowing squares. For example, where the blue was, I see yellow. Where the red was, I see green. And eventually those colors will fade out because your eye will now adjust to seeing white instead of color. But this is what this theory is all about. It's kind of proving to an extent that your eye sees colors in very complex ways. Your eye sees colors in opponents, seeing colors as complements as well, both firing at the same time, but inhibiting one and letting the other one be seen. The opponent theory helps to explain the phenomenon of after images, which are visual sensations that occur after a color stimulus is gone. So here's another one. Look at the black dot. So after image is something that can be concerning. For example, you might have noticed that doctors wear green scrubs. This is because when they are operating in the operating theater, they are looking at a lot of red. They're looking at blood, they're looking at tissue, and their eyes become used to looking at red. So much so that when they look away, it can be jarring and keep looking at that black dot. It can be jarring for them when they look at any other color. So because green is the complement of red, when they look at a green object, it sort of eases them into a normal color sensation rather than shocking their system and almost giving them a headache because the color sensation is so drastically different. So we're done looking at the black dot. Let's jump over to the black dot on white, and you should see some after image. You might see a blue dot where there was an orange dot. You might see a white ring where there was a dark blue ring, and they might float away or vanish away. But that's after image. Your eye is becoming tired, and then you're kind of giving it a cold shower when you look at that white panel. This one is the most fun of all. We look at a photo negative of a man's face, and we focus on that white dot on his nose. And we should be looking at it for about 10 seconds, as it says in the directions. And interestingly, what's going to happen, not only will we see a three-dimensional portrait of this man, but we'll also see it potentially in full color, even though we're looking at a photo negative of him. When we jump over to the white square, you'll see that he's got a tan, he's got dark hair, and depending on the light quality you're working in and depending on the strength of your vision, you'll actually see the man appear on the white square, and it's very trippy. You know, you don't think you're going to see him as well as you do, but then you do. So that again is after image. In some cases, we see an illusionary image that is the color opposite of what we have been staring at. It may be that when the signaling mechanism for one color is fatigued, its opponent color is no longer inhibited. The after image is also called successive contrast. After images cannot be explained simplistically. We can only guess at what is happening in our perceptual apparatus to create the effect. In 1955 and 1977, Edward H. Land, inventor of the Polaroid instant photo process, made a discovery that has cast doubt on attempts to discover structures in the eye and brain corresponding directly to wavelengths of light. Land projected two black and white slides taken of the same scene from two projectors, placing them so that they overlapped exactly. One slide was taken with a red filter and projected through a red filter. The other was taken with a green filter and projected with a white light. So on the right, we have a mock-up of Land's experiments. So we've got black and white photos being shown through colored lenses or gels. So you can see we have red, green, and blue in this example. When projected on top of each other, so the images overlapped on a screen, they reproduced an approximation of the hues of the original scene, including blues, yellows, oranges, and greens. Land's discovery also worked when yellow and red lights were used in the projectors. Neither traditional wavelength theories nor trichromatic theories can explain this phenomenon because Land's subjects saw colors with much less information than was thought possible. For instance, a blue or orange wavelength was not needed for people to see those colors. One explanation for Land's results would be that higher structures in the brain were seeing colors of familiar objects rather than seeing them as they actually appeared. But in Land's later experiments, people discerned colors in abstract patterns of colored squares. Land proposed that the human brain works differently than a camera. Where a camera will photograph the same subject in different types of light and record the effect, the human brain will view the same object in multiple types of light and see the same color, because their brain knows the color that it should be. So our brain, again, is simplifying and overriding the fact that it is a different color in a way to control chaos. Our mind is reminding us that a banana is always yellow, regardless of what type of light we view it in. Land called this behavior color constancy. and theorized that the visual cortex of the brain works in conjunction with the color perceptors in the retina of the eye. Land's Retinex, which is retina plus cortex, theory has been supported by neurobiological research that demonstrates the existence of tiny blobs at the back of the skull. These blobs seem to compare visual information from an object with what is seen immediately surrounding it. A red fruit will seem redder when placed near a green leaf, for example. So here we also have this interesting phenomenon of color, which is that color affects other colors. Color does not exist in a vacuum. It is affected by the environment, by the light, and the objects that it is placed or seen next to. As each of us is inherently different from the other, so too do we view colors differently. We may see the same red paint with the same wavelength, but the input to multiple sets of eyes may vary based on genetics, age, and so on. Major variations from the norm can be discovered as forms of color blindness, which is a genetic defect found most often in men as the gene is carried on the X chromosome, 7% of which cannot distinguish red from green. So 7% of men are colorblind. And the most typical kind of color blindness is red-green color blindness. Conversely, 3 to 4% of women have a fourth color cone and can be considered tetrachromats, which is, as I said in here, freaky, but that's very unique. So they have an even stronger sensitivity to color. So in these 6 circles, we have tests for color blindness. And a test for color blindness can be as simple as looking at these circles and determining if we can see the numbers inside. So the first circle on the upper left has a 25. It is clearly, or rather, it's probably the most clear test to look at because it's a contrast of orange and blue. The next circle on the upper row has a 45. The next circle has a 6. On the lower row, we have 29 on the left, 56 in the center, and 8 on the right. So if you do not see these numbers at all, you might have some color blindness. If it takes you a little time to kind of see it and focus on it, that's okay. It just means that your vision is not as strong, but doesn't mean you're colorblind. Our emotional state can affect how we see colors. When one is depressed, colors appear dimmer than when one is happy. When severe depression sets in, people often describe a visual sensation of darkness. We speak of seeing red when we're angry and feeling blue when we're sad and being green with envy. Perhaps these statements could be linked to real neurobiological processes. Emotional influences aside, artists and scientists have identified some variables that can be manipulated to influence color perception, such as the size of the colored area, the surroundings, the surface texture of the colored object, and the lighting under which an object is viewed. A large expanse of color will generally appear brighter than a small area of the same color, and a small area of color may even appear darker than it really is. The effects will also depend heavily on the color of the backgrounds. All colors are affected by the colors around them. When the intensity of a color changes based on the color surrounding it, this is called simultaneous contrast. So in this graphic, we have an example of an exercise done by the color theorist Joseph Albers. And Albers did experiments in color and color reaction and simultaneous contrast. So in these 4 groups of different colored rectangles, the smaller rectangles at the center of each pair are actually the same color. So it's the same color of blue, orange, green, and purple. But because they have been surrounded by different colors, those colors affect the way our eye perceives the smaller rectangles. So the pink makes the blue appear darker, while the green makes the blue appear lighter or brighter. And this happens because our eyes are mixing the colors together. So this happens in interior design. You bring something into a room, you saw it in one place, you've brought it into the place it's going to be installed, and the color changes. And this is because the color is different. This happens repeatedly with paint selections. It happens with hardwood flooring selections. You end up with a color that does not look the same as it did when you were in the showroom. And it's because our eye is mixing the colors together, and the colors are having an influence on what we see. Here's an example of that. We have a background that is a gradation of black to light gray. On top of that, we have superimposed a narrow horizontal rectangle, which appears to be changing from light gray to dark gray if we look left to right. However, if we were to remove that background, we would find that the rectangle is the same color throughout. Our eyes are telling us that because the background is getting lighter, the rectangle must be getting darker, and vice versa. So it is an optical illusion, but it's also something that our brain is kind of conditioned to do. Again, to make things simpler. Adjacent colors can also change each other's apparent hues. So this painting is George Seurat. He is known to be a pointillist artist. He's also associated with the Impressionists, but pointillism is painting a painting with little dots of paint, not brush strokes. And you're not mixing the colors together. You're painting with little dots or specks of paint, and you're letting the viewer's eye mix the colors. And the eye creates the shadows and the highlights and the contours. So from a distance, this very large painting looks like it is modeled very nicely. It has highlights and shadows, it has a gradation of color. But if you zoom in on it, which we're going to do in the next slide, we're going to look at the dog right down here. If you zoom in on it, here's what you're actually looking at. But from a distance, your eye has blended all of these colors together, has created a volume for the dog, has created highlight and shadow in the grass. And again, our mind is trying to simplify our environment. And so we see things in a simpler way. You know, once you look up close at this, there's a lot of detail going on, but from a distance, it looks very smooth and very orderly. But up close, it's very active. You know, you can see the different angles of the brush strokes. You can see that the colors aren't really blending together. Your eye is blending it together. So that's what pointillists explored. This pointillism is something that's still with us today, even outside of the art world. Magazines and newspapers do this same sort of production when they are printing on a printing press. The magazine cover may look like a photo, but when you look at it closely, if you were to hold it all the way up to your eye, to the fovea, or if you took out a magnifying glass to look, you would see that the image, the photo, was actually made up of a series of layered dots. So pointillism in newspaper and magazine publishing. A third important variable in how we see color is the light in which we see a colored object. Fluorescent light, in general, has a blue cast. Incandescent lighting has a yellow tint, and LED has an intense white light in general, although there are lots of different colored LEDs available now. Natural light, however, changes with the shifting of the sun, cloud cover, particles in the air, and so on. So in this photo, or this pair of photos, we have the same man, the same color cards, but he's being photographed in different colors of light. So down below, you can see from the changing colors of the background, he's being photographed in a warm light. So this is probably an incandescent light. And you can see that he's got more of a tan complexion. The color of the wall has changed. The color of the sofa has changed. Up above, he's being photographed in a cool light, so maybe a fluorescent light. And because of that coolness, his skin tone has changed, the color of his environment has changed. And look at how the colors of the papers have changed. The green is still green, but the paper here in the upper part is pink, down below it's blue. The blues are still blue, but we have a green up here and a yellow below. We have a purple and then a pink. So look at how the color of the lighting has influenced the color of the objects. So this is why lighting is so important in interior design, not just to be energy efficient, but to show the environment in its most beautiful capacity. Despite all of these variables, we tend to perceive colors as unchanging because of our visual memory. Something in our brains compensates for actual changes, allowing us to generalize color perceptions, protecting us from visual chaos. So above, we have an image or several images of a time-lapse photo of the sun rising and setting. So when the sun rises, we have this sort of cool morning light. And as the sun starts to set and dusk sets in, the light gets darker. The color of the sun changes as it gets further away and starts to set. The ozone changes, the haze in the environment changes, the light bouncing off of the water changes. But if we were to look at it in real life, standing in the same position looking, we would always see the sky as blue. We would always see the grass as green. But a photo doesn't lie. A photo tells us the reality of the environment and the situation. So that's the wonderful contrast between a camera and the human mind. The human mind wants to control the visual chaos, as we just said, wants to simplify things, and the camera, as they say, does not lie. In contrast with our automatic reactions to changes in color, the artist Claude Monet made it his mission to paint the same subjects over and over and show the radical changes in color created by the ever-changing environmental light. Discarding the idea that objects maintained their color under any circumstance, Monet trained his eye to see each moment as it occurred. And this is what the Impressionists were all about. It's the impression of an environment, of a landscape, of that moment. That's why they favored so many plein air paintings, going outdoors and painting landscapes and bales of hay and waterways. To observe the effects of light on Rouen Cathedral, he rented a room across from it and spent months working on painting, each at its own easel corresponding to a different time of day. He completed 20 canvases, each showing different light qualities through the different colors he saw. So above, we see all of the paintings of Rouen, 6 of the 20. And while the architecture does not change, we can see that Rouen Cathedral, because of the light, because of the weather and the climate, it can be seen as red or blue or gray or yellow. Is there fog? Is there rain? Is it a hot sunny day? Is it overcast or clear? This all affects the way that Monet saw color. In addition to size, surroundings, and lighting, the color we perceive depends on the characteristics of the surface from which it is reflected. A shiny surface will reflect more light as well as the colors around it, while a porous or rough surface will absorb light and make colors appear darker. Best example of this is choosing your paint sheen when you are picking paint for your home, whether interior or exterior. The glossier the sheen, the more light will be reflected. The lower the sheen, the darker the color will appear. Your sheen or gloss level should also be selected based on use. Glossier surfaces, like a high gloss or a semi-gloss, are generally used for objects that receive a lot of abuse, such as doors, baseboards, door cases, and window frames. They get touched a lot, they get rubbed up against, you want the paint to last. The sheen is actually a protectant. It keeps the paint from getting marred and it makes it easier to clean. So satins, semi-glosses, and glosses are also easier to clean. Eggshells and flats are a little more difficult because they don't have that protective glossy finish. So they can stain a little more easily. and they're harder to clean. Lower traffic areas like bedrooms, which are private spaces, can receive lower gloss paint like a flat or an eggshell. Bathrooms and kitchens, because of moisture and oil and just the use of those two spaces, should probably get paint that's a little glossier, like a satin or a semi-gloss. I would never do a flat or an eggshell in the bathroom because you're just asking for trouble. But the sheen not only reflects light, it protects the paint. Another interesting color sensation is this one. Many of us perceive color through senses other than our vision. The blind have been known to feel color, and some perceive color when hearing sounds or musical notes. Some also perceive colors with numbers and letters. So for example, you might see yellow and think of the number 5, or hear a certain sound and think of a color. This phenomena is called synesthesia, which is the combining of two forms of perception. The last part of this lecture is an online color challenge. So copy and paste this into your browser and take the online color challenge.